You've had a really eventful week this week, just like you did the first week we talked to. I'm just going to let you take it away here because we've got a couple. You've got a lot of irons in the fire here, and they're all going in the right direction. Talk about that.
So, our company started in 2015 around the problem that we saw, where there's a $30 billion worldwide market for antidepressant drugs, and every one of those drugs has a warning on the label saying this drug may cause suicide.
What was the one that they used to always? There was always one drug that people, was it Xanax or something?
Zoloft?
Zoloft.
Yeah.
Where remember all those drugs back in the mid-90s that people were taking? I don't hear about those drugs anymore. Are they still there?
That's because they've all gone generic and nobody's promoting them anymore.
Okay. All right.
But they're still widely used. And they all cause suicide because anything that raises a chemical called serotonin in the brain increases the risk of suicidal ideation. So there's a whole new generation coming along, drugs that treat a different switch in the brain, which happens to be called NMDA, where we know that these drugs can decrease suicidal thoughts within hours. We know that these drugs are potent antidepressants, but because Big Pharma left the whole psychiatry space when their drugs went generic, nobody's been taking them to the American people. That's really how our company started.
Question?
Yeah, I mean, I have questions about the whole thing. And you said that some of those drugs cause suicide ideation.
Not some, all.
All. And so then you're talking about specifically ketamine now, right?
Well,
When I say those drugs, we're talking
about Zoloft
and that whole generation.
But now you are talking about bringing ketamine to the forefront so people can take that because that can cure suicide ideation.
Let's talk.
Let's talk about the mechanism.
Yeah,
so I talked about drugs that affect a switch in the brain called NMDA.
Yes.
It's really just a pipe that either lets certain kinds of ions into the brain cell or doesn't. And ketamine is like putting a cork in that pipe. It works instantly like that. But it's also like jump-starting your car. If you've got a dead battery, that's a really good way to get back on the road. But if you did that every day, you'd blow up your car's electrical system. So we're also long-term working on an oral drug that, instead of putting a cork in that NMDA pipe, it's more like turning a faucet. Doesn't have the neurotoxicity. It doesn't kill brain cells the way ketamine does long-term. It's not addictive the way ketamine is long-term. It doesn't cause the same level of hallucinations. It doesn't have any of the toxicities that ketamine has. So, ketamine can be magic, and I've seen it be magic for people who are acutely suicidal, and we now know that it's better than electroshock therapy, which is a horrible treatment, but it's the only thing that works.
I have a question, first of all. If somebody has suicidal thoughts, okay, I'm not betting on the fact that they're going to go see a psychologist or psychiatrist or a doctor and say, you know what, I mean, some of them might, but I'm having suicidal thoughts, and I need a pill to prevent these. Now, is that an addressable market, or are we talking about people that identify those patients, and we're going to funnel that into that
So
addressable market?
the CDC knows that 3.4 million Americans every year make a plan to kill themselves.
Wow.
Our data shows that close to 700,000 people a year show up in hospital emergency rooms with somebody saying they're having suicidal thoughts.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay.
And yet there's a big gap in between because those people who aren't identified, some of them make an attempt, survive the attempt, and get to care, and some of them succeed and don't get to care. But part of it is because we're not willing to step in, and say, are you thinking of harming yourself? You see somebody limping, you're not afraid to say, is your knee hot and swollen, or is your leg bad? But you see somebody who's clearly depressed, who's not engaging in the social interactions we have, and we don't have the courage to say, are you thinking of harming yourself?
So if in a perfect arc of this story, let's say we have a patient, not a patient, let's say we have a person who has suicidal ideation here, okay? And you have a drug here called ketamine that can help. And we have a family, friends, community that should identify. How would you like to see, if you could wave a magic wand, how would you like to see that manifest itself so they end up at the pharmacy, or somebody does, with a path to life?
Because right now the path that doesn't work is they take them to a hospital emergency room. Talk to the average psychiatrist. the psychiatrist will say, and is bound to say by his code of ethics, you need to go to the emergency room. Psychiatrist is not going to hear about a person with suicidal ideation and say, come see me in the office. That would be malpractice. So, right now the path is to the emergency room. The emergency room locks you in a room. They got a security guard standing outside the door.
Plus you got that 3-day thing.
And then they're looking for a psychiatry hospital bed, and that could be across the next county. It's a nightmare of a scenario. So
Sounds
you
like
say,
sitting on hold for MasterCard.
Right.
Right.
I mean, I
So
like it's the most inefficient model.
So what would I like to see?
Yes.
I'd like to see a model where somebody is identified as being acutely suicidal and immediately goes to a place where we've got a drug that's going to put away those thoughts on the short term, and then drugs on the long term that are going to keep those thoughts at bay.
So instead of driving Aunt Julie to the hospital, where am I going to drive her so they can have an identifiable? Because I think what we're talking about here is, I mean, there's a straight line here, but currently it goes like this.
Yeah.
Where would you suggest? I mean,
Well, not only does it go like this, but it's a dreaded place to go.
so do we need to just have better education in our health system with respect to drugs like ketamine?
Well, there are 1,000 ketamine clinics in the United States today, and if ketamine was legal, if it was on label instead of doctors having to use it off label, if we could set up a system of care so that we could both treat a person effectively, but know that if the treatment doesn't work, we've got a way to get them into acute care hospitalization.
You told
If we could do that properly, we could save easily
hundreds of thousands of lives.
Hundreds of thousands.
You told me a few weeks ago that the Department of Defense has set up ketamine as a standard of care. Why can't everybody do that?
Well, the Department of Defense just went ahead and did it. And they didn't do it yet for acute suicidality. They did it for depression, but they did it ahead of the FDA's labeling. So there's lots of things you can do within the Department of Defense that are not necessarily labeled by the FDA because the Department of Defense has a different level of authority. But until you can get these drugs on label, until you can show the FDA that you've got safety and efficacy that they can review, and a system of care can be set up, this stuff is not available to the average American. It's only available to people who can pay cash.
Right.
Is that being worked on? Sorry, the FDA approval.
Well, we're the only people working on it, as far as I know.
So let's talk about NRxP. Let's talk about what you guys are doing. Let's talk about the good news here, because we've addressed the problem. Obviously it's something that we see, and of course, since we're an American Forces Network, we talk about veteran suicide top line almost every week. Talk about where we're at. What's the latest news?
And when you say veteran suicide, we're talking about losing 22 veterans every day.
No way. Every day?
Yeah.
Wow.
We've lost more veterans and more armed forces personnel to suicide than we have lost to combat in all the wars fought in the history of the Republic.
Wow. All right, so talk about the good news on how we're making strides with you guys. What do you guys got going?
So we're at a point where we believe we have what's called fileable data, where we've got 2 well-controlled clinical trials that demonstrate that ketamine is more effective than placebo for acute suicidal ideation and for depression in people who are acutely suicidal. And we're gearing up to bring that to FDA as an application for a new drug approval, because right now ketamine is only approved as an anesthetic.
Sure.
Now, in order to do that, of course, we need to set up a manufacturer, and FDA won't even look at a new drug until you can prove to them that that drug is stable in its container for at least 9 months. It's kind of inside baseball kind of stuff, but everybody says, oh, let's just approve this drug because we have a clinical trial that shows that it works. FDA says, okay, now prove that you can manufacture it, and it's going to stay stable on the shelf.
Okay, so this is like a deal that comes to me for investment whereby I can see the value in it, but because of what the FDA sort of, the roadblocks here, it doesn't have intrinsic value to the market. Why not spin it out into its own company and then use your other assets in NRxP that owns this company? I mean, that's a license to steal at that point, because once this thing hits the starting gate, I mean, it's a game changer. Once all of those impediments are gone, am I accurate about that?
Well, I would think of it as a license to save lives. and the fact that our investors
Yeah, but I'm
are
a
gonna
money
do
guy,
real-
but you're
the
right.
fact that our investors will do really well in the process.
Oh yeah, you guys
good
save
for
lives.
them.
I'm talking about stock. I'm talking about money.
Right.
But it seems to me that you guys have a good strategy here going forward. If what you're saying, Zach, and we can get rid of the impediments, that's the biggest part of this thing, right?
Yeah, and when you say get rid of the impediments, everybody says, well,
FDA.
the FDA. Yeah, everybody says the FDA is the bad guys. No, they're not. The FDA's got rules, and their rules were set up for good reason. I mean, one of the biggest problems we have in the United States is you've got drugs coming from overseas that are poorly manufactured, that sometimes kill people, and the FDA was set up to prevent exactly that. I don't call those impediments. I call those, paths to approval that just have to be done right.
Is your intention to manufacture in the U.S.?
Not only is our intention to manufacture in the U.S., we've identified a high-quality manufacturer in West Columbia, South Carolina. We're doing the chemistry with them. They just passed a 2-week-long FDA inspection last week. It's not easy
Can
to
you
do
share the
this
name?
stuff.
Are you allowed to share the name yet?
Yeah, we've said publicly that we're partnered with NRx Pharmaceuticals in West Columbia, South Carolina. And next time I come see you, I'm going to bring Lou Kennedy with me.
Oh, great.
Okay, last of all, and I hope we'd love to have you on every week because we do these longer interviews, and it's fascinating. You've worked for 4 presidents. You've worked for big companies, universities. Why are you? I mean, you're kind of a rock star. What are you doing here in a small cap? I realize you're saving lives, but you could write your ticket on the administration. You could go to Harvard. You could cash
I've been
out.
to Harvard.
And they're done.
Because here's what I'm trying to get to. It must be pretty good. The future must be pretty bright for a guy like you to be in this company.
Why am I doing this? I'm doing this because nobody else will. President Kennedy said we're going to the moon because it's hard. And yeah, I've worked in big pharma. I've never worked on a drug that hasn't already been rejected by the FDA. Okay? I've never worked on a project that somebody said couldn't be done.
And you believe in the outcome.
And I believe in the outcome.
Yeah.
Dr. Jonathan Javitt.
Yep.
NRx Pharmaceuticals, NRxP. We'll see you next week. You're committed.